Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 107 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I thought I would take a deep dive into the Bio-Rad enforcement action. I'd take a look at the NPA given by the Department of Justice, the cease and desist order from the Securities and Exchange Commission, the background facts, some of the lessons learned, and then a more detailed discussion on internal controls and a best practices compliance program. The episode is about 21 minutes. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Hello everyone. In this episode I wanted to visit about the Bio-Rad enforcement action together with the opinion release of last week, 1402. I think they're both highly significant and very informative for the compliance practitioners, so I thought it might be good to take some time to visit about both of these going forward. The Bio-Rad enforcement action was quite an interesting matter. First, it is important to note that the company received a non-prosecution agreement from the Department of Justice, which I found very interesting given the underlying facts of the case. They also received a very large fine and penalty from the SEC, largely around their profit disgorgement of $40.7 million. Bio-Rad came to grief over actions from their emerging markets division, which included the countries of Russia, Thailand, and Vietnam. They had three separate bribery schemes going on in those countries. Mike Volkov pointed out that one of the anomalies of the case was that the agent that was used in Russia, and it appears the three individuals involved in the emerging markets, the region manager and then two folks who reported to him, did not participate in the internal investigation and are not part of this company enforcement action. It certainly doesn't mean that they would not be subject to further prosecution somewhere down the line, but I found that to be certainly interesting. The non-prosecution agreement identified Manager 1, who was a high-level manager of the company's emerging market sales region, and Manager 2, who worked for Manager 1. In Russia, they used a scheme where a commissioned sales agent, although he was named a distributor, he was really a commissioned sales agent, received a commission of 15 to 30%, purportedly in exchange for various services outlined in agency contracts, including acquiring new business, disseminating promotional materials to prospective customers, installing the company's products and related equipment, and training customers on the installation and use of the company's products, and then delivering these products. But in reality, this agent did not have the technical ability to do any of these things. Additionally, the company had others who physically delivered the products, so even a simple delivery service was not needed. There was no evidence that the agent brought any new business or prospective customers to the table for Bio-Rad. But the thing that certainly needs to be focused on is the commission rate. And here, this is something that I think a lot of compliance practitioners do not really think about as closely or as much as they should, and that's the overall commission rate. And that's because if you have a 15 to 30% commission rate, that is generally going to be viewed as quite high by the Department of Justice. It doesn't really matter what business you're in. And although you certainly could consider having a commission rate or discount rate for a distributor at that level, you need to have some sort of market-based basis for or justification for having such a commission rate. So with a commission rate of that magnitude, of course, it can be clearly used to pay and facilitate bribes. So this is something that I think from the Russian bribery scheme was clearly important to note and to look at going forward. But the other thing of interest out of the Russian scheme was that they actually had contracts in place. And I detailed some of the services that the agent was to deliver under those contracts, but the agent couldn't or did not deliver those services. So that brings up an interesting issue of, if you have a contract in place, how do you audit that contract? How do you test that contract? How do you use that contract as a detection or prevention prong in your compliance program going forward? With certainly regard to some of the services that the agent was to provide, there was no evidence that the agent did any of those services, and that certainly can be checked on an audit going forward. But it brings up the need for continued vigilance after the contract is signed. This situation in Russia regarding Bio-Rad clearly did not have the requisite contract management or management of the relationship after the contract is signed. So that is something that a compliance practitioner needs to consider going forward. So the management of the contract after it is signed is certainly a part of the business unit's responsibility. So you need to have checks by the business unit on the agent. But then the compliance function needs to come in and put a second or even third set of eyes over this. That can be in the form of regular reports to the compliance function, detailing what the business unit has done with this agent, the interactions they've had with this agent, the training they may have had with this agent, the annual certifications that the agent should be signing. You should be reviewing those. But more than simply compliance, putting a second set of eyes on this, when you have an agent in a high-risk area, with such a high-risk contract or commission rate of 30%, that may be the time that you want to put additional or a third set of eyes on it in the form of audit. And audit can come in and do a deep dive to determine if the services were delivered based upon the contract and measure that up. You may also want to monitor going forward, so you can take a more broader look at the expenses that are being piled up and submitted, as opposed to a deep dive, which audit would do on a more long-term basis, on a more lengthy basis, a retrospective look back, but less often than it can be done with a monitoring. So some very interesting lessons to learn from the Russia bribery scheme. In Vietnam, a company had an interesting bribery scheme that really revolved around the authority of the country manager. The country manager could make payments at $200,000 or less than $200,000 without oversight, or indeed without a second set of eyes approving that. And because of that, very large payments were made, both for bribes and then after the bribery scheme was moved to a third party, to agents. So the clear import from the bribery scheme that the company used in Vietnam was, even if you have a delegation of authority, if it's at a level which can generate funds significant enough to pay bribes, and certainly $200,000 would be in that range, you have to put a second set of eyes on this. This does not mean you have to check every transaction, although that's certainly something that you may want to consider. But if a spot check of transactions where you have a number of transactions at or immediately near the level of authority of a particular officer, or country manager, or region manager, that clearly warrants additional investigation to see what is going on. The other thing was the success rate. In Russia, it was specifically noted that the agent involved had a success rate of 100% in obtaining sales. And I think that any business person would know that you never have a 100% success rate. So this is something that if you have that type of success rate by one agent, that's something you need to take a look at going forward. So the third scheme was the scheme that was used in Thailand. And here this was a little bit different, but it also brings up some very good lessons learned for the compliance practitioner. In Thailand, Bio-Rad made an acquisition, and in that acquisition it got a 49% interest in a joint venture through the acquisition. It does not appear that Bio-Rad did any acquisition due diligence on the Thailand business unit of the acquired company or the joint venture involved. So that was sort of issue number one for the compliance practitioner. But thereafter, the bribery scheme of the joint venture involved paying an inflated commission of 13%, of which the JV only retained 4%, and 9% was paid to Thai government officials. And further, to top it all off, the agent of the joint venture were the same people who were the joint venture's majority owners. So they were taking it to Bio-Rad both from the left side and the right side. Clearly, Bio-Rad was not looking at this joint venture very closely and move forward. So the lesson is that the compliance practitioner is going to have to look at all of the types of business structures that a company may use going forward, whether that be a joint venture, whether that be an agent, whether that be a distributor, whatever mechanism you have in the sales chain needs to have significant FCPA scrutiny going forward. One of the other issues that the Bio-Rad enforcement action brought up was the corporate structure itself. And here, perhaps not uncommon in the medical device or pharmaceutical industry, was you had a corporate structure that was quite decentralized. And you had 4 international sales organizations, excuse me, Western Europe, Asia Pacific, Japan, and emerging markets. And really the regional manager of each of those sales organizations held sway over each one of them. So part of the problem was that the compliance function could not get the visibility in the corporate home office that it needed. The emerging markets clearly had the highest risk, and there were not additional compliance personnel, resources, or services delivered to this emerging markets sales unit. And if you have one that is clearly that high a risk and the highest risk in your organization, you need to be able to deliver the services involved to that organization. The other sort of item of interest, I would say, from the Bio-Rad enforcement action was the NPA and the SEC settlement. Both documents spoke to the lack of internal controls. Now, with an NPA, I think that's a pretty clear message from the Department of Justice that they were not able to tie the requisite intent or criminal conduct together to have a deferred prosecution, criminal prosecution, or something other than what was delivered or received by Bio-Rad, the NPA. But the NPA also spoke to the significant and extensive cooperation that the company had with the Department of Justice, and once again shows that cooperation is the key to receiving a much lower FCPA penalty. That was also clear from the Lane Christensen enforcement action, and we had the opportunity to visit, or I had the opportunity to visit with Russ Berlin, lead outside counsel for Lane Christensen, where he talked about the extensive work that the company did in the investigative phase of the matter. So clearly, extensive cooperation with the Department of Justice does pay benefits. So what are some of the internal controls failures that were identified? Well, I posit that there were 4 very gross or large ones going forward. The first of these was on the delegation of authority. I talked at some length about the amount that the Vietnamese country manager could contract without prior or additional oversight. I misspoke. It was not $200,000 but $100,000, and it could pay commission rates of $20,000. And nevertheless, even that amount certainly is enough to generate money to pay bribes. You've got to put a second set of eyes on something when you have such a delegation of authority. And when you have a country manager that can make those kinds of distributions, they need to be scrutinized before they're made, not after. The vendor master file. This is not something that most compliance practitioners think about in terms of part of their compliance program. But their vendor master file can be one of the most powerful control tools there is or there are. Your vendor master file must be structured so that each vendor can be identified not only by risk level, but the date on the vetting, which vetting was completed, and the date they received final approval. Electronic control should be in place to block payments on any vendor for which vetting has not been approved. And then manual controls are needed over submission approval and input of changes to the vendor master file. Here, it appeared that the country manager, or at least the regional emerging markets manager, was able to actually enter and put companies onto the vendor master file without an additional oversight, and it appears without going through the proper vetting process. This should have been picked up by the vendor master file, and it should have been communicated electronically to the compliance program. Your contracts with third parties. Once again, not many compliance practitioners think of contracts as internal controls, yet this is something that can and should be a part of your internal control system. Properly documented, a contract would hopefully prevent compliance issues from arising going forward. Nevertheless, we saw with Bio-Rad, and I went into some detail about the falsehood of the contracting process and the services that will be delivered. So this would be something that you would need to have your internal audit come in where you have a third-party representative flagged as a high risk, and before any payments are made, invoices should be pulled and approved to actually see if the services were delivered going forward. And then a fourth internal control is your disbursement of funds. If you have situations where money is going to be sent outside the U.S., it should be reviewed from an FCPA risk standpoint. Your goal should be to identify ways in which a country manager could cause funds to be transferred under their control and conceal the true nature of these funds. Clearly, we saw this from the Russian country manager, the emerging markets regional manager, and the Vietnamese country manager. So the disbursements need to have a second set of eyes put on them, and then if you can tie that into your SAP or other ERP system, that would be your best practice going forward. So those are some of the examples of the internal controls, which I think would be an important part of any compliance program, but also are illustrated by the Bio-Rad enforcement action. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the best practices compliance program that the Department of Justice talked about in the NPA. And here we had the Department of Justice list out 13 items which they said should be a part of a best practices compliance program. So let me just go through these because I think it's important to reiterate. Number one, a high-level commitment by management by providing visible support from senior management. Two, appropriate corporate policy around anti-corruption and anti-bribery. Three, specific policies and procedures in the following areas: gifts, hospitality, entertainment and travel, customer travel, political contributions, charitable donations and sponsorship, facilitation payments, and then solicitation and extortion. Appropriate internal controls to ensure that transactions are authorized and properly recorded. A periodic risk-based review, in other words, a risk assessment, so your policies and procedures need to be reviewed and updated and no less than annually, or reviewed no less than annually and updated as appropriate. Number six, compliance function should have proper board oversight, independence to act, and support within an organization. The compliance function should provide training on and guidance to the business units on its anti-corruption compliance program. There should be mechanisms for employees to internally report compliance issues of concern with no fear of retaliation. Number 9, a company must maintain and provide effective and reliable processes and resources and respond to any issue which is raised through internal reporting or other mechanisms which get information to a company. Number 10, a company must use both incentives to encourage behavior and discipline of employees who violate its compliance program. Number 11, third parties must be subjected to an appropriate level of due diligence based vetting process, have an appropriate contract in place, but most importantly, thereafter must be managed going forward after the contract is signed. Number 12, there should be a protocol for evaluation of any potential acquisitions or merger candidates, and then review and remediation after the acquisition is complete. Here, think about the Bio-Rad situation in Thailand. And then finally, number 13, going forward, there must be ongoing monitoring and testing of the compliance program. So the Bio-Rad enforcement action has lots of very good information for the compliance practitioner. I would encourage you to take a look at the enforcement action itself, or you can read my 3-part blog post on it, which would give you some pretty good insights. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions, you can contact me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Thank you very much.